All right. Hi, everyone. Just want to, I can never tell if the video has started. I feel like that makes me old, but there we go. The time is rolling now. Okay. Hi. So, yeah, we're going to jump into the second half of 1 Corinthians 7. Um, we had been on the first half of the chapter, which I know there's a lot of good conversation, and I anticipate the same thing for the second half. Um, Okay, so the looking back section is just looking back on FTLT, what stood out, takeaways, things like that. So spend a few minutes there if you would. Okay, so the second half we are going to read verses 17 to 24 again, because those verses serve as kind of a hinge in the chapter. The second half is not unrelated to the first half. There's a lot of things that feel similar, but there's some different takeaways in the second half of the chapter. So we're going to read this hinge section again to see how it relates now to the second half, if that makes sense. So basically, there's two things happening here. The first one has to do with circumcision, and the second one has to do with slavery. So both interesting issues. Um, so Paul is basically saying you shouldn't seek to be circumcised or not circumcised, because he says what counts is not circumcision, but keeping the commandments of the Lord is what counts. You might be thinking, well, I thought circumcision was a commandment from the Lord, and you're not wrong about that. So we need to talk about that for a second. So I have the question here: since circumcision is an Old Testament commandment, what does it mean to keep God's commandments? And I'm pointing you to some passages. First Jesus and then Paul, Matthew and Romans, to look at what it looks like to fulfill the law. That Matthew 5 passage is especially interesting, because Jesus is saying, I'm not coming to abolish the law, I'm coming to fulfill it. And then the other passages shows you what it looks like to fulfill it, namely love. And actually, the next chapter, 1 Corinthians, will be about this as well. But so I'm asking you, what does it look like to fulfill the law in modern times? Because Jesus is not coming to abolish the law, like he says, but the heart of the law is to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor, right? And how that looks in different cultures and in different settings is different. Some things will be the same throughout time, and some things will change. We'll see later in 1 Corinthians there's the issue of head coverings, and that's not gonna translate. That's not a law per se, but you get the idea. There's some things that kind of need to be that are expressed differently at different times. And circumcision had to do with the old covenant. So circumcision is not the sign of the new covenant. Um, and the new covenant is the fulfillment of the old covenant. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. But what Paul is suggesting that we not do, I have in my note there, he's suggesting that there's nothing about our external circumstance um, that enables us to or disqualifies us from living an effective Christian life. We shouldn't look around at our circumstance and say, well, now I can really serve the Lord because blank, or now I can't because I'm too busy. If I weren't in school, I would have more time. That's not always true, by the way, but none of those things is the essence of what it means to live a Christian life. Rather, it is how we live in any given situation. Philippians 4 talks about this, how Paul has learned to be content in all situations. So that's generally the argument here. Your external situation, um, even something like circumstance, or it's like circumcision, is not what it means to serve the Lord. So you have to understand that to understand what he's saying about slavery here. I have a big long note about slavery because people want Paul to say stronger things about slavery, and I understand that sentiment, especially given our country and its history. But please read that. You get on a big tangent there, but spend some time there if you need to. But I encourage you not to spend too much time there. But basically, he's saying, regardless of whether you're a slave or whether you're free, please note that he says both. You need to um, serve the Lord in that, and to not be a slave of human beings, whether you're a slave or free. Don't be a slave of human beings. And I'm asking you to think about, what does that mean to be a slave of human beings, or servant of human beings? And I'm tipping my hand a little bit with the next question, because I'm asking, what human relationships or positions of status carry the most weight in your life? And the way that we can think about that, 'cause we say God carries the most weight in my life, and that's the correct Sunday school answer. However, I think that we'll find that if we answer the next question, in what way do these relationships shape the way we make our decisions and spend our time? We might find that we have other priorities. Maybe being a significant other is a priority, or a student. Um, and so I don't want to say that, having human relationships is mutually exclusive from loving the Lord, right? The way we love other people often is an expression, it is an expression of our relationship with God. And there's also this sense that we need to prioritize our relationship with God in and of itself. So I'm asking you to consider that here, and the challenge at the end will be about that. Um, so to recap that section, your external circumstance, whether circumcised or not, or slave or free or whatever, that does not enable or inhibit you from serving the Lord. Rather, it's how you serve the Lord in that situation. And so we're thinking about this in light of all of our human relationships and our situations and our positions. And so we're thinking, which things are pulling on us a little too hard? And how can we reprioritize our relationship with the Lord so that we can serve Him well in everything that we do and with everyone we know? Whew, that's a lot. That's the first section. The big section is 25 to 40, and this is again a message to the unmarried. So this has a lot to do with you guys, and he speaks to the married folks as well. Now I have some notes here. We have that same stuff. I have no command from the Lord. There's some really interesting translational issues about virgins, betrothed. I have some notes on that, so please see those. Always the question, of course. So Paul gives a couple reasons why he's encouraging people not to get married. I'm pointing you to the verses there. And I want you to note that the crisis situation in Corinth was not likely some, oh no, like the church is being persecuted and all these things. That's probably not what's happening. Now, I can't say there wasn't persecution, um, but I historical evidence points to that probably not yet. Um, I guess there could have been like pockets of persecution here and there, but I don't think that's what Paul is thinking. Uh, and also, please know that Paul very well may have thought that Christ was going to return soon, and that shouldn't break our brains because Jesus Himself said, "I don't know the time when the end will come, when I'm going to return. Only the Father knows that." So it shouldn't hurt our brains that Paul doesn't know either. But what's important is what he's assuming. He's assuming that it's going to be soon because that's what we have to assume. In First Thessalonians and some other places, there's this kind of sense of like, hey, you need to be awake. You need to be aware that because we don't know when Christ will return, it could happen presently. It could happen at any moment. And so there's always this sense of urgency. Now, the second coming shouldn't scare us, and we're going to get to this in a second. I guess I've moved on to the next one. What are the implications of the second coming? As believers, it shouldn't scare us. It should be a great joy for us because Christ is going to come. He's going to redeem the earth. He's going to save us, and we don't have to be afraid of judgment because of Christ. He's going to make us whole. We should look forward to that. Also, there's implications for those who don't know Christ that are not as good, to say it very lightly. Condemnation is not something to look forward to. And so as we think about the unknown timing of the second coming and that reality, this should motivate us not only to holiness, personal holiness, but also to love and urgency and sharing the gospel with others. So in light of that, Paul says in verses 29 to 31 that we should live, he's asked all these really hard things like, I've lost it, sorry. Yeah, those who have wives should live as if they don't. Those who mourn should, as they aren't mourning. Those who are rejoicing, and so on and so forth. He's basically saying this urgent situation of the unknown timing of Christ's coming should bring us out of whatever situation that we're in and cause us to see all things in light of that. And by the way, I know that he doesn't talk about the second coming here, but I'm getting that from just his general witness in Scripture as he talks about urgency and things like that. By the way, um, so I'm that's where I'm getting that. So I have a few questions there. What ways do you tend to be engrossed in concerns of this life? And then I have what I think is a really important question. That's why I highlighted it. Do you think that Paul means that we should try to be involved in the world as little as possible? And I think that the answer is no, um, because that's not the general idea of Scripture. Like to be urgent about the gospel doesn't mean to be unconcerned with the world. In fact, it means to be very concerned with the world. In all that we do, we need to be thinking about like how what we can do can influence people and the culture and things like that. Think about some of the things that Jesus said and did. He was very concerned with people's situation, whether they're widows or poor. He's saying that the way to love people is to do tangible things. James has a lot of that. And so we shouldn't say like we don't want to have what I call lifeboat theologies, like quick, like get everybody on the boat. This thing is sinking. Like we should be involved in the world. When the scriptures talk about set our minds on things above, not on things below, what it means is that we should view everything in this world in light of the eternal reality of God. Um, and it changes our relationship with things. Remember, creation is not the problem. It's our broken relationship with God that creates a broken relationship with creation. That's the problem. But now I'm preaching to you. So let me move on. That's the idea there. The next section is about marriage. Um, sort of. It's sort of about marriage. But what I want you to note is that Paul is calling for undivided devotion to the Lord still. And this is very different from how we think about singleness and marriage. Of course, in marriage, marriage is thought of as like the preeminent thing in a lot of Christian circles. And marriage is important. Paul has some very high things to say about marriage, but it's not the thing. It is a great thing. It is not the thing. And in the same way, some people think about singleness in ways that are a little bit off. In some ways, this scripture resonates with culture. Be like, yeah, singleness is restrictive, or marriage is restrictive. Singleness is great. I'm going to get married later because I want to do my thing. I'm going to get my career going. I need to figure myself out. That's not exactly what Paul is saying. It's kind of the same outcome, maybe, but the wrong reason. Paul's reason is that he doesn't want you to be concerned with yourself. He wants you to be concerned with the Lord. And singleness has some benefits there. So he's calling for undivided devotion. And the question I ask, why do you think that's difficult for people who are unmarried? Why is it difficult for single people to have this undivided devotion? What are the things that compete for our devotion? And then I have you looking back to verse 29. In light of these things, how do we live out verse 29 if you have time? Okay, last section. Paul's basically ending with a bang here. He ends with a super kind of snarky comment in verse 40, which is great, very Paul. There's translational difficulty in 36, so I have a note there. He's basically saying again, like, hey, marriage and singleness, neither is bad. Both are good. Remember, they're having this issue of like we should abstain from sex, we should not get married, or if we are, we should not have sex within marriage. And Paul is saying, I think it's for your good to not get married, but if you do, that's good too. It's not wrong. So I just want to end with just basically a broad question. Knowing what you know from 1 Corinthians 7 and beyond, how should we, and we as single people is what I'm kind of aiming at, desire, wrestle with the desire for a significant other? Because people who are single, and I have been single, wrestle with this desire. And so how should we think about that in light of all these things that Paul said? What are some of our closing thoughts? How should we move forward? It's kind of what this question is. And then if you have time, how do we honor God, whether in singleness or marriage? Okay, so trying to put a bow on this. Okay, finally, the conclusion. I have a sheet for you this time to hand out to your people or to email to them. Please encourage them to do this. Lean into this. Text them during the week. I hope I've explained it well, but basically there's two columns. On one column, you're going to write out all your relationships as you currently prioritize them. So I give some examples, but like, let's say one of your relationships is that you're a son or daughter of God. Another relationship that you have or role that you have is that you're a student of Virginia Tech. And I want you to ask yourself honestly, which one of those things takes priority in your life? If those two things compete with each other, which one takes priority? And try to make a list. And then I want you to assess that list by writing out, if I could, in an ideal world, if I were prioritize these as I want to, what would that look like? That's on the right hand side of the sheet. And then make some notes. What needs to change for you? And I've done this exercise personally. It's such a good exercise. And some of you did this at a prior leadership meeting. So this really should only take, well, it could take a short amount of time. I hope you'll spend some time on it, but shouldn't take too long. But anyway, that's all I got. Let me know if you have any questions. I will talk to you soon. Bye.